It seems impossible to me that the Armenians were not conscious agents of the Russian government. We can't prove it, of course. We don't have a sheet of paper that says, "We will be your boys." But we do have very telling statements, besides what they actually did in the war. For instance, the fact that the Russian government gave the Armenian rebels the equivalent of $15 million today, just before the war, in order to buy guns. We do know that the attacks of the rebels in places I've told you about, like Sivas and Sarai, where you couldn't possibly expect any other reason for an attack, we know that those can only have benefited the Russians, which is the really important point. It doesn't really make any difference to the Ottomans whether the Armenians are accidentally helping the Russians, whether the Armenians are accidentally killing hundreds of thousands of Muslims. It doesn't make any difference. The point is that they are doing it, and that the Ottomans know they're doing it, and that they feel they have to do something about it. Not only so that they can continue to fight the war, but so that they can defend the slaughtered Muslims who are being attacked by the Armenians. And that's the answer to the question. Why did the Ottomans relocate the Armenians? They did it because they justifiably feared them. They feared them because they were the agents of the Russians, their enemies, and they feared them because they were slaughtering Muslims. Was deportation a harsh measure? Yes, an exceedingly harsh measure. Was it justified? Well, surely the Ottomans felt it was justified because they couldn't think of what else to do. We'll never know. We'll never know whether it was justified or not, what would have happened if it hadn't taken place. But it is definitely true that lives were lost, Armenian lives were lost because of the deportation. Ultimately, were more lives lost, or more lives, I should say, saved because of what happened, because of the deportation? We won't know that either. But it does seem certain, and we do know for certain, that relocation was seen as a justified act in wartime by the Ottomans. And we do know for sure that the intention was not to kill all the Armenians. We do know for sure that it wasn't in any sense a genocide, but what the Ottomans believed was a justifiable military action. If we need proof that it wasn't a genocide, we can look once again at what really happened in the relocation. We can see that the mortality of the Armenians in that big blue area that goes to the south, which is what they call the Armenian genocide deportations, that in that area, where more than 400,000 Armenians were indeed relocated, we find that 20% of them were dead. We find that 20% of them died. Well, this is horrible. This is horrible. I very much doubt if it's genocide, but it's horrible. But then we have to compare that to the death rate of the Armenians who were in the war zone and who retreated in the far right up here. This group. We have to compare it to them. Those Armenians who were in the war zone and who went away not being deported by the Ottomans but running for their lives, more than half of them died. Actually, the Armenians who were relocated by the Ottoman government did better, quite a bit better. It's still horrible. But in looking at that horror, we have to also look at what happened to the Muslims, the Turks, the Kurds, the Ottomans who stayed loyal to their government. What happened to them? There were hundreds of thousands of Armenian refugees, yes, but there also were more than 1 million Muslim refugees, those green arrows that you see. People who are never talked about, as if they never existed. We also have to talk about what happened to the Muslims of provinces like Van. At the end of World War I, 2/3 of the Muslims of Van were dead. So if we talk about what happened to the Armenians and how they suffered, and we should, we must also talk about what happened to the Turks and the Kurds, to the Muslims, because they suffered at least as bad. When we ask, did the Muslims ever actually commit acts against the Armenians? Were Ottoman officials ever involved in actually organizing massacres of Armenians? Yes. Just like Armenian rulers, or Armenian leaders or parties were organizing attacks against Muslims. We know for sure in 2 areas of Anatolia, in Trabzon and in Harput, that there were officials who did order the massacre of Armenians. We know that this took place. Just like we know there were the massacres of Muslims as well. The difference between the massacres of Armenians by Muslims and the difference between that and the massacres of Muslims by Armenians was that the Ottomans tried and convicted the people who were guilty of crimes against Armenians. At least they tried to as well as they could. The numbers that you see there are the numbers of Ottoman officials and others who were tried and convicted of crimes against Armenians during the time of the First World War. Many of them were hung, including one Ottoman governor, for crimes against Armenians. How many Armenians do you think were tried for crimes against Muslims? None. This is an indication that there could not have been genocide. Can you imagine Hitler trying members of the SS for what they did to the Jews? It didn't happen. But in wartime, people do evil things, and evil men come to the forefront on all sides. And the Ottomans recognized this, and they did what they could to stop it. The relocation also shows us other things that indicate that there could not possibly have been a genocide. As you can see on the map, in Istanbul, 80,000 remain. In Europe, 24,000 remain. In the Izmir area, 11,000 remain. In the area where supposedly all the Armenians were relocated, 43,000. These are all Armenians who remained and were never moved anywhere, who were never attacked, never hurt, who were never massacred, and surely were never the victims of genocide. The Armenians of the Ottoman capital lived out the war in peace and security. Once again, does this sound like genocide? Can you imagine Hitler saying, well, I'm going to kill some Jews, but the Jews of Berlin are just fine? This is an absurdity. The Ottomans did not attack, did not hurt, did not even relocate these Armenians because they were not a threat. And because they weren't a threat, they did not take military action. If nothing else, this should indicate to you that there could not possibly have been a genocide. From what we've seen then, I hope you'll understand that the Ottomans were correct in fearing Armenian rebellion. They feared that those who had been traitors against their government and helped their enemies in one place would do it in another place, and they wanted to move them out of those places. They feared that, and they believed they were justified in taking an action to defend against it. Was it the right action? We'll probably never know. It definitely had its problems. In the middle of wartime, the Ottomans did not act perfectly towards Armenians, and as they say, there were places where Armenians really were massacred. Even though the Ottomans tried to do something about it, tried to try the criminals, tried to protect the Armenians, nevertheless the Armenians suffered terribly. We'll never know. We'll never know whether they saved more lives than they cost. But one thing we do know for sure, and that there was no genocide.